Today I'm choosing to honour Woody Harrelson, an actor. He's not an actor whose entire filmography I'm familiar with. In fact, I know that a lot of the content that he does is for quite mature audiences, and I remember him in a film called Natural Born Killers years ago, and one of the films that I remember him most fondly from was called A Scanner Darkly, which was an amazing animated, I think they called it Rotovision styled picture, which was directed by Richard Linklater. Anyway, he's a very funny man. He came from a difficult background. Apparently, he grew up in a very poor family, dependent on his mother because his father had been convicted for killing a judge. He was a hitman who went to jail and eventually died there. So Woody Harrelson's introduction to the world was anything but easy, and one can only imagine what it's like growing up with a father who is behind bars, who one has very little contact with. He was brought up, as I understand, in a fairly strict Presbyterian, that's a religious family, a Christian family. And it seems that he's a very broad character, dearly loved by many. But the reason I've chosen to honour him here today is that in the last few years he spoke out repeatedly on the subject of freedom at great cost to himself, probably closing many professional doors because he was willing to stand up and be counted when most people were turning a blind eye to government manipulation, to waves of propaganda that most people seem to duck down and want to not talk about because they were afraid of what it would do for their jobs, for their careers, for their families. And it's understandable when people have that kind of fear, when one's actions might have profound implications on the quality of our lives. And that I suppose is what made his position less radical, because he was a man that already had an established living. He could probably never work again and still live, you know in a very enviable lifestyle for the rest of his life. And yet there are many people who shared his his privilege and his level of possessions and wealth, who could have spoken out without, worrying about the consequences of whether or not they're ever going to get another acting job, and yet didn't. They chose to remain quiet, even when it went against their awareness, their conscience. Um, and he didn't. He stood up and he said what mattered to him. He spoke his truth loudly, but with artistry and with humour, without becoming belligerent and a finger-pointing advocate for you must follow me or believe what I say. But he spoke his truth. He stood up to be counted. And from the world of Hollywood, very, very few people have done as such in recent years. And it's fascinating because of the scandals that have been emanating from Hollywood over the last 10 years or so, from the Me Too movement, from all sorts of different child and sexual exploitation that has clearly been a running theme in that industry. It's amazing to see people who have garnered a position in that world, in this kind of very questionable industry, and yet used their public audience, used their position and the pedestal that have been put on for good, to be able to speak eloquently from the heart about the things that they saw going wrong in our society. It's going to take a lot more of us to act with that degree of courage and confidence and care in order for us to even begin to have a world that is reflective of the sort of freedoms that we would all love. Um, for anybody who questions whether or not freedom is something that, that we should have, some people seem to think that a far more controlled utopia is possible. Well, I ask you, if you are one of those people, to question how much restriction to your freedom are you willing to tolerate? Being told when you can eat chocolate, being told who you can fall in love with, what you can do with your time. How, when people advocate or seem to be who seem to think that a utopia is possible where state control is able to determine what it is that we can and cannot do, who we can speak to, who we can listen to, where we can go. They haven't fully thought out in their own personal lives what it feels like to be told what to do. Who has parents for whom they rejoice when they tell them what it is that they're supposed to be doing with their time? I believe that we all have a very deep-seated need for autonomy. That means being able to be self-governing, being able to decide what it is and where it is and when it is that we act or choose not to act. And any kind of social system that contradicts this very fundamental and universal human need for autonomy, one only has to look at children and how desperately they want to be able to determine the clothes that they put on, when they get to eat, what they get to eat, what games they get to play. This is something that goes so deeply into what it is to be a human being, in fact, indeed, to being an animal. Animals can be domesticated, animals can be trained, and yet they still have a profound desire to follow their own instincts, their own intuitions. So today, I'd like to honour Woody Harrelson, who was born on this day and despite all his challenges, managed to carve what appears to be a pretty wonderful life for himself in this world, and yet risked everything in order to be able to speak his truth and share what was really on his heart at a time when a lot of people were silent. So here's to Woody Harrelson. And indeed, to all of us who are willing to stand up and be counted.